everything for me has grown out of drawing. Since I was an art school undergraduate, it's always been about drawing, not even about photography or sculpture or other forms of making. It's always been about pencil and paper. And, you know, it's been 20, maybe more, years since I've been working as an artist, and I've been going from media to media trying to see what I could do with my pencil and my paper, right? So I used to work on large-scale drawings. I moved to printmaking and was working with etching and lithography, but thinking of that as an extension of my drawing practice. And that led to the dollhouse, so probably my first sculptural piece that I did. But everything in it, really for the most part, is still 2D drawings that are mounted upright with struts or glued to the walls of the dollhouse. But it's really in an effort to take what's a flat plane of paper and now project that into space, to see what that looks like, to see the cast shadows, to see the edges of the paper. When I had my thesis exhibition for my dollhouse, a colleague of mine in the program said to me, "Gee, Jen, I can imagine all these different rooms, these different tableaux that you have in your dollhouse being an animation, right? Because they were so narrative." You know, and I thought for a second, I went, yeah, you're right. A Wunderkammer it's a German word for basically a cabinet of wonders, or in English they're usually referred to as cabinets of curiosity. So they were cabinets that well-heeled 18th, 19th century gentlemen, usually of some degree of learning, would have in their houses, and they would have items usually of scientific curiosity. So they could be shells from around the world, coral. You know, they might be more in a scientific realm, so they could be wet specimens like jellyfish suspended in a jar. And the more unusual, rare, from more exotic locales the item was, I guess the more interesting or more curious it was. And presumably these were entertainment centers. I mean, one can imagine anyway that the person that would own such a cabinet would invite people over into their parlor and open it up, and it would be a kind of a show or a spectacle as people looked at the various items. So basically I just start with drawing, right? So I'm going to draw in my sketchbook just the initial concepts. The first thing I did for this project was decide the design of the Wunderkammer and the contents inside of it. And I really needed to nail down what in fact was going to be in there. So this is the sequence that I did for the octopus that appears in the Wunderkammer. And I think it was just 6, right? And so I did my initial drawing in the sketchbook, and then trace the first one on the light box, and then I just do small changes. And this one is just he's wiggling back and forth inside of the wet specimen jar, so it's just 6 in a reversal. I want you to know that what you're looking at is a physical object. This is an actual physical cutout that I've created, and you're looking at a photograph of it. And so the fact that you can see the shadows, you can see the edges of the paper, to me are a bonus. It speaks to the art form. Not many people would do this, certainly not for any kind of a longer film. There have been feature-length films done in this art form, but it's kind of an antiquated medium at this point. But I think maybe for that reason alone, I'm drawn to it, and it allows me to capitalize on my strength, which is my drawing, since my background is more, I'm a fine artist, or an artist that has moved away from doing still images to creating these animations. For me, the strength is in the drawing. So I feel like this particular way of making animation really, hopefully anyway, capitalizes on my strengths. There's a specific image by Toshio Saiki that actually was the jumping off for this. He's a Japanese illustrator called sort of the godfather of erotica in Japan. I'm a fan of his images, even though at the same time they're kind of problematic. You want to keep looking at it because it's so beautiful, and there's a lot of craft to his work. And yet at the same time they're discomforting. There's something that's clearly grotesque. For myself, in my own work, really, for the 20 years that I've been making images, I've been chasing after that. It's a feeling, it's a mood, really. And it's this feeling of wanting to look at something, because I draw my images in a certain way. If I can be guilty of anything, I tend to make my images maybe a little too pretty and not as grotesque as maybe sometimes I set out to. But I go to great pains to, have a lot of detail, pay a lot of attention to aestheticism. But at the same time, I will insert these troubling scenarios, characters. There will be an element in them that sort of like, ooh, it's repellent, and it's that combination of the attractive and the repellent simultaneously that I've been sort of chasing, and that this film is sort of an attempt to try and get a handle on that as well. This film is personal in a way that I'm not sure I could easily explain to most people, that all the items in the cabinet have a personal attachment to me, but in ways that may not be immediately evident. I really wanted to have a little throwaway moment in the movie where the camera is panning by and you see something unexplained, like this weird screaming face, but the camera doesn't stop. You have no answers as to what that deal is. Like, well, how is that alive? What is it distressed? What's happening? I always really like those moments in movies. So I was determined to have a couple of those kind of what I would call sort of throwaway scenes where we kind of pass by it, we're with it for a moment, and then we move on, no explanation. There's of course the box, which is probably on first view the least interesting item in the cabinet when we first pan down through it. But then of course it becomes the item of interest to our protagonist, the character I call Madeline, for reasons that later become revealed. And the box itself is kind of it's almost like a cabinet or a Wunderkammer inside of the Wunderkammer, right? Because they're both these shut containers that contain these unexplainable mysteries. The last thing was the thing that I couldn't decide for the longest time what it was going to be. So I had looked at these images on the internet of, I guess you would call it this Illuminati eye, this kind of all-seeing eye, and I just liked the image. And even though it's the thing that probably makes the least amount of sense in the cabinet, I just threw it in there as kind of filler. And then as I started working on how things would move in the cabinet, I made a decision, well, this thing could just bob up and down and blink. And then when I shot that scene with the pan, I realized that, this was just a single cutout, and I just had a couple of blinks that I would sort of throw over top of it. But it was giving me a lot of bang for my buck. In the sort of the big reveal in the film, it becomes this, almost the main character. I mean, with this style of paper cutout, all the works happened in the drawing stage. So really it's kind of procedural when it comes to actually shooting it. You're just really swapping in. I guess the biggest trick is to make sure that the replacement is right over top of its predecessor. A lot of it's self-taught, and I've just developed my own style for animation, and it's not surprising that one of the first scenes that I animated was actually the bird babies from the dollhouse, because there was an implied noise, the screaming of the bird babies, and I really wanted to hear them, and it had to be animation to be able to see and hear those crying children. I've been hooked ever since, really. I can't imagine now going back to a still image. I don't think I would ever find that satisfying. My work has been largely narrative. I mean, I would think everything from my earlier work where I'm creating a body of drawings, to the dollhouse, to, now moving on to animation. I mean, each one is a world that you create, particularly with the animation. I'm literally, from the ground up, creating a universe with backgrounds and characters, and I'm dictating what's going to happen in it, and it has rules that I determine what the rules are. How does this character move versus another character? So I suppose there is a sense of control, and perhaps it's just simply that, in doing animation, you have control over a very small part of a world that you create, in a world, in a life where one really doesn't otherwise have control. There's that whole quote that animators are masochists with God complexes, and I always thought that was like a very apt assessment, right? Because you would have to be kind of crazy, I think, to some degree, to put this much time into something that, 3 summers of my labor produced a movie that's just over 5 minutes long. Pleasure in the work, I think. I think most animators, that's what they sort of take away from it, is almost a pride and pleasure in creating these worlds and troubleshooting. There are days when it's hard to tell yourself that when you're tired of working on a scene, but yeah, definitely for me, it's all about the work.